have David Campbell here. He did a huge multimedia research project for the World Press Photo Foundation. And he's been working on the context of what is changing in this world of media. And what does it mean for the industry, economically, and for the profession. David originally comes from Australia. He's been living in the UK for a long time now. And is working on this for years. He first wants to give us a little bit of an insight by way of three impressions of the industry. David.
So as Monique said, my task was to kind of update you to some extent on a couple of things that are really significant in the media economy in 2015. And by the media economy, I mean the whole sort of media infrastructure about how we produce, access, consume, distribute information, and the way this might affect the work of visual storytellers. So it's 2 years on from the publication of the World Press Photo Multimedia Research Project. The title of that was Visual Storytelling in the Age of Post-Industrial Journalism. And I wanted to go back and look at some of that and then think about what might have even been accentuated to a greater extent and what might have changed. And I think most of the trends that we identified in that are absolutely, they still hold. But if anything, they've accelerated to an extent that is probably a little bit surprising, I think. So let's start with a graph, a visual we haven't had yet amongst all the visuals. 2015 is a significant year. This is the year that we've seen globally more people go online than use television as a media platform. So online has surpassed television for the first time, and as you can see, it's well above radio and well above print as the way people access information. That's the global summation. There's a lot of regional variation. You can see that in the lower graphs. So much regional variation that Africa is not included in the graphs at all here. And of course, it has much lower internet penetration, but growth there, particularly also for cell phone networks, is significant. So this trend is coming, I think, for all regions. And you see the hours spent by individuals each day with media ranging from 8 to 12 hours. So a phenomenal amount of time spent with media, and now spent, because it's online and TV, spent with the screen. And that's really kind of one of the major conclusions that we made last time, but has now been accentuated even more, and that is the screen has become the primary access point for information over and above everything else. I love this graph, or this image, because it shows the way that the screen takes over. But it also combines the two things that I think that do make for the most distinctive feature of the media economy in 2015, and that is the combination of the screen and mobile. And those two things are really connected because the primacy of the screen is closely intertwined with the growth in mobile devices. There are now 2 billion Android and iOS devices currently in use. That's going to grow to 3 billion, which means they've well and truly surpassed the number of personal computers that exist, which is 1.6 billion. And mobile phone ownership has grown dramatically in all the world's regions. So the smartphone, which is really a touch-screen device with internet access, it is, and probably has become, and certainly is becoming, supreme. 2/3 of adults in the US, 2/3 of adults in the UK, 2/3 of adults in Europe own a smartphone. That's the highest proportion so far. Other regions will also see similar sorts of numbers. 3/4 of American teenagers have smartphones. And although, again, there's, at the moment, regional variation, the growth trend is up and onwards for this. There, we're going to see those numbers globally for everybody. This one's a little bit difficult to see on this screen because it's a long graphic, but the circle is kind of a 24-hour day segmented into various periods. And it's sort of illustrating the types of screens that you might use at various points, from the smartphone to the tablet to the television to the iPod to whatever. And the significance of this is that although we talk about mobile devices as being, one of the growth areas, mobile devices are not really mobile in the sense that we conventionally use the term. Yes, they're handheld, the touchscreen devices are handheld, they're not connected to landlines, they're wireless and so on, but they're not mobile in the sense that they're only used on the move or in transit. They're used at every point of the day, and in fact the greatest time and period of use for mobile devices is in the home, on Wi-Fi networks and so on. So the idea that the mobile device is something that someone only uses when they're on public transport or on the move or whatever is quite incorrect. Actually, they're used often in sequence with other screens in the home. And in the UK, for example, tablets and smartphones together are now the most common way of accessing the internet. 60% of time spent online in the UK is done through touchscreen devices connected to the internet. So I think it means, this for me is probably the most significant thing, the primacy of the screen and the importance of mobile, but understanding mobile is not actually just this thing on the move. The significance of this is that we need to think about mobile devices as not a scaled down version of the internet anymore. In fact, as one analyst said, actually the personal computer is the scaled down version of the internet because you only access it through the web browser on the computer. The smartphone and the tablet are actually total internet devices themselves. And so that's where you get the complete internet experience. The smartphone is also inherently a social platform because it's connecting to your contacts, to your calendar, to notifications and so on, putting you into networks in a way that other devices aren't doing that. And of course, as image makers, we know that the smartphone, above everything else, has absolutely eaten the camera. There are more iOS and Android devices now than there have ever been Japanese cameras throughout history. So it's absolutely eaten the camera as a device as well.
Now, if we take these three, data points,
Sure.
Everybody has the screens, and the screens are everywhere. So what does this really mean for the makers? I mean,
well, this is where the audience is.
Yes.
I think this is the key point here. We often focus rightly on the side of production and distribution and so on. But if you want to think about your audience is on a touchscreen device connected to the internet. So you want to think about how that audience is going to be able to both access, see, interact, and engage with the project that you're engaged in. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be scaled down and short. I disagree slightly with Marie's point about brevity being, the sign of the digital age. I mean, yes, that has a place, and the haikus are incredibly powerful and so on. And to solve certain problems, brevity is important. But actually, a lot of the data shows that people engage more often, more times during the day, and for greater periods of time, the more, quote, mobile devices they have. So the more access they have, the more media they consume, the more time they spend with it, and the longer form pieces that they're happy to interact with as well.
Okay, but there still would be dipping in and out of streams of media consumption, right? You have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have news, you have email, there's work, maybe.
Occasionally, yes.
But there's a sort of going in and out of media, sharing media, consuming media. Now, if you are a maker, and many of the people in this room are makers, should you mainly obsess about what you're making, or should you actually be, developing whatever it is, the tool of the day, the app, the HTML5 site, the social media shareable content, where should the focus be?
Well, I'm sure everyone is making something because they want it to do something, but they also want it to get to people somehow. So you want to be thinking about who your audience is, and when you've identified who they are, where they are. What I'm saying from these data points is that it's highly likely that the vast majority of your audience is going to be coming to you through these devices. This is definitely the case for news organizations in the world. I mean, in the US, as of January this year, something like 39 out of 50 of the major news organizations, New York Times, etc., now have the majority of their readers coming to their online sites through these, quote, mobile devices.
When we talked before, you mentioned this. I asked you about, I've been doing internet conferences for 20 years. I'm old, but when you start, it wasn't even clear what a website should look like. The navigation could be up or down or right or left, but over the course of time, formats have developed, understandable formats. There's still experimentation and variation, but there's an interaction format. And for these makers in these new tools, do you think we have now developed certain formats that people will use, that are known to the audience and the maker? So this is the way we interact, this is the way we focus, this is the way we leave your story, come back to it? Or is it still completely at the beginning and unknown?
To me, I think it's still completely at the beginning. I think it's completely open. A lot of the forms, of course, are driven by previous forms. So think about the notion of a web page, for example. That's a print form taken into the online space. But now everyone's kind of dispensing with that. It's come late to major organizations. It was about 18 months ago the New York Times gave away the idea of web pages and went to complete scrolling from top to bottom. But anyone who
There's no front page anymore. It just goes on and on and
on.
Just goes you reach on. The end of the archive.
There's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the bottom to click, because they worked out if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the bottom and you ask someone to click, you lose people because they don't click the next one.
So
but if it keeps going down, that scrolling structure kept the audience much more engaged. Anyone who ran a blog, from the early 2000s knew that from the start, because that was the blog structure. So it took those organizations a long while to catch up with that. But that form is still taking place. Now that we're on touchscreen devices, of course, the app and touch is the way that people are accessing those. And search is playing less of a role in a lot of these things in the news and documentary field.
Yeah, because apart from the more general developments you described, you've very much focused on the industry. Now, I want to really open this up to the audience. So, people from the audience, questions for David about the observation he has made. Bless you. It's a nice sound.
Or someone can touch a screen and send a message.
Yeah, I get, you're not a tweeting bunch, you are, to be honest. There's not a lot of tweeting going on, but feel free or shout. No questions. I can keep asking. That's not a problem. Well, for the industry. There is one. Very good. Yes. How do you do your research?
Well,
you sit there
spend
and watch
a lot of time online.
Documentary all the time. Yeah, that's it.
Well, there are various sources. I mean, a lot of this data will come from sources like the Pew Project for Excellence in Journalism in the US, which produces this big thing called the State of the Media each year. The Reuters Institute for Journalism at Oxford produces a big digital report each year. The industry itself, is producing a lot of analyses, because people are trying to work out, well, where is the audience? How do you reach them? How do they consume information and media? So
what does the audience? What does the audience want? Did you research that?
Well, I mean, that's too big a question by itself. What you can say about news and documentary is, I mean, we have this notion that people have become distracted, people have become more superficial, they spend less time, and they're all obsessed with celebrity. All those things are wrong, actually. I mean, the data shows all those things are quite incorrect. Then when you ask people, and then when you do ethnographic studies on how people engage with the news, interest in the news is high. I mean, in Europe, for example, the lowest level of interest in the news is in France, but 2/3 of the people still declare that they're interested in the news in France. Okay. So, there are substantial, the majority of people are still highly engaged in these things. The amount of media being consumed, news and documentary media being consumed, is going up. The willingness to access long-form material is high and growing, actually because of the proliferation of devices. And, interestingly, on 2 points, there's this notion about information overload, that people can't cope with things, that we're swamped by too much. The Pew research shows that 3/4 of the people say no. They're absolutely delighted to have more and more information at their fingertips,
it's
access
nice
through
to be
these
distracted, you know.
But they're not distracted, they're engaged.
No?
That's
okay.
it.
Yeah. No, but it's a form of engagement.
Totally, absolutely.
Stimulus all the time.
Yeah, only about a quarter of people in those surveys say that they feel completely overwhelmed by information. So the idea that everyone is overwhelmed and swamped, there's no data for that.
Other questions from the room, because yes, there's one there and one there. Shout at the back.
Yes.
So just to repeat, yeah, for the rest of the audience, well, the question is about who's the authority on what is interesting to watch and see, and very often traditional media companies are playing that role. I would say social media networks do that. I
they
get
play a
most
role.
of my cues from my network.
It's a really good question because there was, for a long time, search was a really powerful way in which people were able to access, a multiplicity of sites, and of course that still happens. You have the capacity to search, but actually the rise of touchscreen devices have favoured the app, and the app has favoured more traditional and established media organisations. And people like to go to trusted sources. So they'll go to The Guardian, they'll go to the New York Times because they have a good app. And when they have a good app, that's probably the one source they might use for that week, and so on. So this has been the opposite of what some of those media organisations feared, which was going to be the total disaggregation, and everyone would, no one would be able to judge what quality was, and so on. That actually,
don't you think there's this other giant in the room called Facebook, which is just gobbling up the media industry in a way?
Well, the 2 points about that. One is, the data shows that when you look at the touchscreen devices favour the use of the app, and people say that 88% of the time spent on these devices is spent in the realm of the app rather than the open web, and that's a little bit misleading, precisely actually because of Facebook. Because Facebook consumes so much time.
Yeah, and now they have this. You can now have native video on Facebook, and you can now have also the publishers' deals where they. I mean, we won't get into that topic. It's not a topic for tonight, but it's just that. Well, it's a big one.
This is the instant articles thing on Facebook.
And there's a question here in the front. Yes, please.
Yeah, a question about your interpretation of one of the first slides you showed.
Right.
The graph from the Economist. Maybe I misinterpreted it, but it looks like Europe is the most traditional
yes.
or conservative. I'm
well,
about that. Do you have any analysis of that? Because at the same time, Europe has this much English culture. How does that work?
Yeah.
I'm curious about it.
This is where I really feel like I'm from Australia. I find it hard to explain Europeans. I'm not sure, is the short answer to respond to that.
Okay.
One possibility, certainly, and this works as an explanation in Britain, because it might differ between European countries. But when you have very powerful public broadcasters or established broadcasters, then they've had an influence over time. So the BBC in Britain has a position that's, say, far larger in the British media economy than even the American networks have in the American economy. So that's possibly one thing going on there for Europe. And yes, exactly.
Okay, I'll take that one question, but you have to wrap up because otherwise the next speakers are out of time. That's not a small question, but what's the future of photography in comparison to moving images? In 2 sentences. One word is also good. But
Impossible. That's not the answer. I mean, everyone is operating, because of the primacy of the screen, everyone, both individual producer and big media organization, are actually operating in the same digital space. And the web page, or the digital space, is as good a home for still photography actually as for video. The popularity of video, although online video is very high as a form of media, very popular, the YouTube upload figures are absolutely right, but when it comes to news and documentary organizations, actually text and still images are more favored than video in those contexts. So the future is not as bad as some people think.
Well, thank you very much.